Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Perry. I am a Moonbooks author, proud to be a Moonbooks author. And this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about Deathwalking Psychopomp work in the modern world. And I am going to go through a lot of terms and specifics. So I'm actually going to screen share my PowerPoint presentation with you. And I promise I'm not one of those people who reads the PowerPoint, but I really do need to set this up. And let me see if I can make it work here. It says it's sharing. Hey, look at that. All right. So Deathwalking. This is also called psychopomp work. This is the practice of helping the spirits of the dead leave this world and move on to the next one. There is a difference between death walking and death midwifery. And these are terms, I don't know how many of you are even familiar with these terms. This is some fairly new stuff in the Western pagan world, at least on a large scale. So death walking or psychopomp work begins at the moment of death. It can take place much later, even hundreds of years after a person has died. And the purpose is to help the spirit of the dead move on and release from their attachment to this world, the material world, the world of the living. Death midwifery is not the same thing, but it is related. A death midwife helps the family before the person has died and during the dying process. They support the dying person and their loved ones. And death midwifery can continue after the person has passed on, but a death midwife supports the grieving family, and that's separate from death walking, which works with the spirit of the deceased. So that's a specific there. So since probably the very beginning of humanity, people have been concerned about what happens to them after death. And specifically, people have been concerned about the spirits of the dead reaching a safe and happy and peaceful afterlife, depending on how any culture conceives of that. But we want our loved ones to be at peace once they've passed on. We want them to be happy so that they don't bother us, but also so that they have fulfillment in whatever each culture considers to be the way the afterlife works. So, for instance, a lot of cultures over the centuries and millennia have written sets of instructions for the dead and for the people who are helping them. So we have things like the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We see some of that here. Technically, it's translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And it's a set of instructions that are actually for the spirit of the deceased, for them to find their way through the many pitfalls and strange activities in the afterlife, so that they can eventually reach the field of reeds, the place that is peaceful rest for them. Another one that you might be familiar with is the Bardo Thodol, which is often referred to as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that's it. It describes the experiences of the spirit of the deceased in the afterlife, in a place that Tibetan religion calls the Bardo, or the Bardo Plain. So these are these books, these writings are ways for people to try to help the spirit of the deceased move on to where they belong in the afterlife. this is obviously a concern for a lot of people. And so, where is the afterlife? Where do people think anyone goes? Obviously, it's awfully hard to know for sure because people don't generally come right back and say, "Hey, I was just in the Summerland and it was awesome. You should try it sometime." Um, so, there's a wide variety of beliefs about where the soul goes after death, depending on the culture and religion of the person. So, it's everything from uh, the Christian heaven or the Muslim paradise to the Nordic ideas of Valhalla and Folkvanger, the Egyptian field of reeds, Summerland, Guinea, um, the Bardo, which is the Tibetan one that I mentioned. These might be combined with a belief in reincarnation, or the idea of reincarnation might be the only thing that there is for the afterlife in some sets of beliefs. So, in that case, the belief would be that when a person dies, they have a short period of time of reflection and then they go right back into another lifetime. And then there's the Buddhist concept of nirvana, which happens eventually after any number of reincarnations when you finally do it right. In Deathwalking and Psychopomp work, it does not matter what the spirit of the deceased believes, because it's not it's not the psychopomp's job to figure out what they believe. It's the psychopomp's job to support them in whatever they believe, in the same way that it's the deaf midwife's job to support the dying person and their family in their beliefs. So there are different places, in addition to different places that people go after they've died, there are different places where the person's remains go. This picture here is the entrance to a Minoan Tholos tomb, beehive-shaped tomb. I've always thought it looked kind of like looking between a woman's legs, and I think that might have been their symbology on purpose, the idea of returning to the mother goddess. But that's just one of dozens, maybe hundreds of different ways that people deal with the physical remains of the deceased. So the person has died. A funeral has taken place. They might be buried in a tomb or a grave. They might be cremated. Whatever their culture, whatever way their culture takes care of that part of things. So their body is taken care of. But what about the spirit? For hundreds of years now, at least a couple millennia, it has not been common practice in the West to do anything to help the spirit of the deceased move on clearly. And it is quite possible for them to get stuck, for them to be confused and not move on. So there are any number of reasons why a person, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so yeah. So we have the person has died and their spirit is free of their body. They're headed for the afterlife, whatever that looks like for them, for their culture and their background. So how do the souls of the dead get to the afterlife? Can they do it by themselves? Sometimes they certainly can. What if they can't? Okay, what if they have trouble getting there? They're going to need help. That's what a psychopomp is for. So why might they have trouble? So there are any number of reasons. So what if they died in a sudden or shocking way, like war, sudden accident, natural disaster? So they're not prepared. Even soldiers in war are not necessarily prepared at the moment that they die, even though obviously that's a concept that's probably looming over their heads all the time. So it can be a shock. And if they're not ready, um, they might have trouble moving on. And in fact, in some cases, like if there is a severe natural disaster or a bomb during a war or something, there might not even be enough of the person's physical body left for them to look at it and recognize that they're dead. Um, so that's something to think about. Or what if they feel like they have unfinished business? What if they feel like their family can't do without them? That they really need to hang around and make sure everyone's okay. That's a reason why they might hang on. Or unfinished business in terms of being angry or vengeful. And I'm not talking about ghosts who haunt people here. I'm just talking about someone who feels like they got cut off before they could do everything that they felt like they had to do, that they needed to do. They might be angry that they're dead. Quite simply, they might not have been ready. They might be mad about it and not ready to take the next step. They might be confused or mentally ill. You don't suddenly become magically perfect when you die. I think it was Casey who said a dead Presbyterian is a dead Presbyterian. So for when you're dealing with someone who has just passed on, they are still who they were when they were alive. They still have that same personality intact. If they had senile dementia, they might still very well be confused. If they were mentally ill in some way, they are probably still like that. So that's when you get unsettled spirits and problems, people who don't want to move on. It's hard to tell, honestly, how big a percentage of the spirits of the dead are the ones who have trouble moving on, because for a couple millennia now in the West, we have not consistently cared for our dead. I'm very happy to see that coming back in the pagan community. We have Samhain events and events at other times of the years when we honor the dead and when we care for them. And there are a lot of people who have ancestral reverence practices now. And those are very important as an adjunct to psychopomp work, because the living need to keep the channels open with the spirits of the dead. Our ancestors, our friends, people we have interacted with, keeping those channels open makes psychopomp work easier because it allows the free flow of energy between the living and the dead. And so when someone does get stuck or confused or decides they don't want to move on, the fact that there is already a certain amount of relationship with the living makes it a little easier for the psychopomps to do that work. So even if the vast majority of people who pass on can move on away from the material world and into their afterlife, whatever that might look like, by themselves, there's still a significant number of people who can't, who experience problems of one sort or another, and that's when you need a psychopomp. So there we go. All right, so this is a fancy sounding word. It comes from two Greek roots. The first part, psyche, means soul, and it is also, psyche is also the name of a Greek goddess. But in this case, it simply refers to the human soul. And the Greek word pompos, which means conductor or guide. So that's exactly what it is. A psychopomp is someone who guides souls, someone who helps the disembodied spirit of the deceased get to where they need to go. A lot of ancient cultures had deities who had this function. So uh, you have the Etruscan god Vanth, Greek Hermes, Roman Mercury. We have Anubis up here attending to a mummy. The voodoo Gede Nibo, Santa Muerte, the Norse Valkyries, the Hindu and Buddhist Yama. So until fairly recently in human history, there have been deities who helped with this process. And so if you felt like there was a problem with your grandma after she had died and you felt like she wasn't moving on the way she needed to, you could approach one of these deities and ask for help. And that was one of the things that they did, was find the spirit of the deceased and help them move on. So that was part of their function. There were probably also clergy, members of the priesthood of these deities, and possibly others as well, who performed psychopomp functions in their cultures. So there would be someone that you would go to in the same way that you know these days that if someone dies and you don't already have plans made, you need to go to a funeral director. So these are like post-funeral directors. These are the deities that you would have approached for help in these situations. And there are still some cultures today where there are, I mentioned Gede Nibo, there are still, that's the voodoo culture or religion. And there are cultures in some regions, particularly the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. I had a list and I lost it. Philippines, China, Japan, where ancestors are an important part of the psychopomp process. So instead of, if you were Roman, you might approach Mercury and ask for help. But if you are in other cultures, even today, you might approach your ancestors and ask for help, because when someone has just died, they are going to become a part of the ancestral stream. And so your ancestors can help them. One of the first serious psychopomp bits of activity that I did as an adult was when one of my aunts passed away, and she was very confused. She was a fundamentalist Christian, and when she died, she thought she had gone to hell because she was not in a place that was filled with angels playing golden harps and paved with marble and all those other things that her pastor had told her were going to happen after she died. She was freaking out. And I ended up calling on her brother, my uncle, who had passed away not too long before, to help her find her way. So that's an aspect of psychopomp work, is not so much doing it yourself as knowing who to ask for help. If you follow a particular tradition that has a psychopomp function already in it in the form of deities or ancestors, then you ask them for help because they are already in spirit form. And so it's easier for them than it is for us humans in physical bodies to do this kind of thing. Let's see, on to the next. Okay, so this is a big thing. Psychopomps do not judge the dead. Regardless of your spiritual background, if you are going to perform this function for people in your family, in the community, wherever, excuse me, it is allergy season. It is not your place to judge anyone. It is only your place to help them. So this is kind of like medical care for the living. It is not a doctor's job to judge anyone. It is just their job to help them get better. And yes, I'm aware we're all human, and so judging does happen, but you have to pay attention and be aware of where your thoughts are going. So a psychopomp's job is simply to help the spirit of the deceased make the journey, complete the journey to their afterlife, whatever their afterlife looks like. So psychopomps may use the help of deities, like I just talked about, or ancestors, or other spirit allies. Psychopomp work is a type of spirit work. The word shamanism is usually used in the modern West to talk about this kind of stuff. I prefer to avoid that word because the culture that it belongs to is still living, and that feels a little too much like cultural appropriation for me. But this is a your mileage may vary thing, I suppose. So I call it spirit work. So psychopomp work, death walking, is a kind of spirit work. That means that protection is necessary. The spirits of the dead are just like living people. They vary widely, and you can't necessarily trust them. That's just how they are. Or maybe you can trust them to be themselves, and you know that that's not necessarily a safe thing. Okay. So some cultures today, and I need to make this clear, psychopomp work is not something that died off a couple thousand years ago with the coming of Christianity in the West. It did not die off all around the world. It did die off significantly in the West, at least in part because the Christian church in its various incarnations and varieties literally made it against the law to perform ancestor reverence and do things to help the dead move on. But there are still plenty of cultures today that actively practice psychopomp work as part of their religion. You have traditional and indigenous societies who never quit doing it. The Vedic cultures, the Vedic traditions in India and the diaspora, so the Hindu practices, in the funeral practices in Hinduism involve psychopomp work on the part of the family and the others who are participating. Vani Neelakantan wrote a beautiful piece about this for the Deathwalking anthology that I edited. There is still a whole host of ancestral practices that also involve psychopomp work in Africa and in the African diasporic religions as well. So the fact that this looks like something new that's been dead for a long time and is suddenly coming alive again, that really only applies to the sort of European-based Western world. So this is not something that has gone away everywhere. All right, so protection is necessary as a safety factor. Yeah. You wouldn't necessarily just walk up to anybody and trust that they'll behave themselves. There we go. And that's true with the spirits of the dead as well. And so you don't want them to be harmed, and you also don't want yourself to be harmed. And that's something that it took me a little while to learn. I began doing psychopomp work as a child, guided by, of all people, the spirit of my great-grandmother, who didn't bother to tell me that I needed to do any kind of protection. So I ended up with some very interesting energetic attachments that took a long time to get rid of. So this is just like any other kind of energy work, whether you're doing healing work or spells or rituals, you need protection. Please don't go diving into psychopomp work without some kind of training. Um, and this is, this is probably the most important thing I'm going to say. It's best if you have specific training in death walking, ideally from a live in-person teacher, because this is energy work and spirit work, and it can be, I'm not going to say it can be dreadfully dangerous. This is not a ghost hunting kind of thing. But if you encounter someone who is angry or in shock and doesn't want to move on because of that, you can end up getting slimed energetically by them. And not because they're necessarily an evil person, but just because they're flinging their emotions around just like living people do. So it is really best if you get specific training in death walking. However, if you are already good at energy working, if you already do spirit work, shamanic practice, and are competent and skilled at protecting yourself and those around you, because the flotsam from death walking can fling itself onto the people you live with. You can ease into it gently with some guidance, please. I will give you a couple books in a minute that can give you some good guidelines. I do still suggest that everyone at least take a class in psychopomp work from someone who is skilled and knowledgeable. Okay, so that's the fair warning. And obviously, to do this kind of work, you need to be able to sense the spirits of the dead. Not everyone sees them as, something you can see with your eyes. Some people sense them in other ways. As long as you are able to recognize and identify them, then you can do psychopomp work. Keep in mind that if you have an ancestral reverence practice, you are already in contact with the spirits of the dead and you already know how to identify them and communicate with them. So that is, ancestral reverence is one way to segue into death walking. And other types of shamanic work, healing, spirit work, healing, and soul retrieval types of things are also another way to segue into death walking. So what does psychopomp work look like? I've had these pictures sitting up here on the screen for a few minutes. It can be as simple as sitting at a funeral or at the family's home afterward, the family gathering, and quietly communicating with the spirit of the deceased, silently if you need to, and reassuring them that it's okay to go on. I've done it. I have done it sitting in the middle of a funeral service or at the family gathering afterward. This does not have to be full-blown bells and whistles, shaking your rattles and singing chants kind of stuff. Spirits are very amenable to contact. In fact, I've noticed that the spirits of the dead are really often quite happy to be noticed, because suddenly, after they die, everybody's staring at their dead body and not at them anymore. So if you can think about it from their point of view. Other ways that psychopomp work can take place. It can actually be an active part of a funeral or memorial service. This already happens in some cultures, even today. And it can be, I would encourage people to work with someone who is well trained if you want to include this kind of thing in a funeral or memorial service, but it can be done. It can also look like a ritual or a bit of spirit work at the location of a natural disaster, on a battlefield. 911 was 9/11 was an interesting and shocking segue for a lot of people into psychopomp work, because there were so many people who were suddenly dead, and they did not find their way to the afterlife easily, and so a lot of people um, set up rituals to help them, and obviously not at ground zero. That's another thing. You can do psychopomp work from a distance. Um, the spirit world isn't organized exactly the way the physical world is, and so things touch and connect in ways that they don't for living physical people. So you can do psychopomp work in many cases, not every case, but in many cases at a distance, the same way that healing can be done at a distance. If you are doing psychopomp work at a place like a battleground or the site of a natural disaster, a big part of what you're doing there is helping the people orient themselves and understand what happened so that they can move on. Even hundreds of years later, there can still be spirits of the deceased wandering around battlegrounds and sites of earthquakes and other natural disasters, in confusion, because time doesn't work the same for them as it does for us. And so part of what a psychopomp does in those cases is help them understand what has happened so that they can let go and move on. Sometimes psychopomp work looks kind of like therapy, honestly. If you encounter a spirit who feels like they can't move on because they're sure their kids can't manage without them, or who is terribly angry at something that was done to them in life, and they don't want to leave until they get revenge. Sometimes it can look a little like therapy, talking these people through what has happened to them and why they need to let go. So it like other varieties of spirit work and energy work in the pagan community, death walking has a lot of different facets. You need a lot of different skills and a fair amount of patience. But it can also be very rewarding because you know that you've helped someone complete their cycle, move on to where they need to be. And that's a good feeling to know that they have um, released from anything that was holding them back so that they can move forward. So, to reiterate, always choose a live in-person teacher if you can find one. However, there is growing interest in death walking, and there are not enough teachers to go around. And this is a big problem right now. So there are some resources that I can recommend. The Death Walking anthology that I edited, Death Walking, Helping Them Cross the Bridge, is a collection of different points of view about death walking, different experiences from a wide range of people with different backgrounds. It can give you a taste of what psychopomp work looks like in the modern world from a bunch of different traditions, and how that fulfills its role in modern spiritual tradition. The other book on the right here is A Guide of Spirits by Chris Allen. This one is not available yet, but it is on pre-order. I urge you to pre-order it. It is awesome. I have read it. I have endorsed it. If you cannot find a live in-person teacher, this is your book, A Guide of Spirits. This will walk you through the process. Take it seriously. Chris is very good about listing the ways in which you need to protect yourself and avoid the pitfalls. This is an excellent resource. So that's it. Are there any questions? I'm looking on my, I'm looking to see. Okay, if you have questions, please put them in the comments. Hi, everybody. Hi, Trevor. Hi, Sheena. Hi, Brian. Hi, Thorn. I've got, oh gosh, I allowed too much time for questions and I'm not seeing questions here. And so, oh, wait, new comments. Hang on. Oh, hi, Janine. Yeah, it's, it begins to become more, the words are not wording right now. Talking about this sort of thing is becoming more acceptable, more comfortable in the pagan community. For a long time, modern Western paganism was all about life and fertility and happy things, and talking about death has been uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable in the Western world. Thank you, Trevor. Sheena, okay, question. What other of your own experiences can you talk about? So yeah, the one with my aunt, I was actually sitting at my desk doing some work and she appeared in my study. That was a little shocking. My very first experience as a psychopomp was as a child. I was about 5 years old, between 5 and 6, and my great grandmother had just passed away. And I had a conversation with her. This was back at a time when they laid the body out in the front room of the house. So I was standing there in the front room of her house, and she was hovering over her body and having a talk with me. And she told me that there was a little girl in my neighborhood who had died and who needed help moving on. And so when I went back home, I went out into my backyard and I realized, none of the adults had told me, but I realized that the little girl was the one who lived right behind me. I realized I hadn't seen her in a while. And so I stood at the fence. We had a chain link fence, and she and I used to talk and play through the fence. And I stood there at the fence and I called to her, and I helped her move on. I told her not to be afraid, and that it would be, and that she knew the way. And children do. Children often do just know the way, and they're still close enough to where they came from to know how to get back there. But because I was a child, I had no training, and I didn't have any way to protect myself. I didn't know what I was doing, except instinctively. And I developed some energetic attachments from that because her family was not ready to let her go. And so there was sort of blowback from that on me because I'm the one who got her to let go. So that's one of the reasons that I really do encourage you to get some real training. the kinds of, oh, hello, there I am in my own mirror. The kinds of protection that you learn to do for spell work and ritual and healing will serve you well for psychopomp work. Just be aware that they're necessary and always protect yourself first. So, a question, have I heard of Shiva acting as a psychopomp? Honestly, I am not that familiar with the Vedic traditions. I know just a little based on what some of my Hindu friends have shared with me. The little that I know about Shiva, I can see the possibility, but again, I'm not Hindu. That's not my background, and my limited experience suggests that maybe I should not give you any kind of authoritative answer because I really honestly just don't know. Looking for online teacher. Okay, in the Deathwalking anthology that I edited, most of the each chapter is written by a different person, sharing their experience with psychopomp work, and most of them, most of them offered ways to get in touch with teachers. That was one of the things that I wanted to include in that book, so that when people were looking, you read about death walking and it becomes interesting, and then you want to know how to do it. There are a number of different possibilities. I can look some stuff up and post links under this video on the Moonbooks page after we're done. So how do you know if you were called to do this? If you're asking the question, the answer is probably yes. Kind of like, how do you know if a deity is calling you? How do you know if a particular tradition is calling you? So, there's nothing wrong with taking some training and trying it out and then discovering that it's not for you. That happens. That's okay. But it's the same kind of feeling, just the knowing that you need to do it. This is one of your ways of helping people. It's that kind of thing. Thank you, Trevor. Our wonderful publisher, Trevor Greenfield, really ought to have done his own talk or been interviewed or something on this conference, because he is awesome. All right, so we are just about to the end of our time here. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the Deathwalking anthology and Chris's new book. And I will post some links on the Moonbooks page once this video is up there.